The knock wasn't loud. It didn't have to be. It was the kind of knock that assumes compliance before the door even opens. 3 measured taps. Not rushed, not aggressive, confident. The sound cut through the house in a way that didn't match the quiet afternoon we were having just moments earlier. My wife paused mid-step in the hallway, looked toward the front door, and then back at me with that instinctive look that says something is wrong even before you know what it is. When she opened the door, the first thing she saw wasn't a neighbor. It wasn't a delivery. It was 2 uniformed police officers, standing shoulder to shoulder, hands resting near their belts, faces neutral in that professional way that gives nothing away. Behind them, slightly off to the side but positioned so she was impossible to ignore, stood the HOA president, arms folded, chin lifted, a faint smile that wasn't friendly but satisfied. Before my wife could even ask why they were there, the HOA president spoke first. "Ma'am, you're being ordered to vacate immediately." The words landed heavy and wrong, like they didn't belong in the space they were spoken. This was our front door, our home, the place where our mail came every day, where our shoes sat by the wall, where our life had unfolded quietly and legally for years. And yet, here was a stranger with a title and a clipboard, using the language of eviction, as if it were casual, as if it were obvious, as if it had already been decided somewhere else without us. My wife blinked once, not in fear, but in disbelief. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't step back. She simply asked the most reasonable question anyone could ask in that moment. "On what grounds?" One of the officers shifted his weight. The other glanced briefly at the HOA president, who took that as her cue to step forward, closing the distance just enough to assert herself as the authority in the situation. "You're trespassing," she said, crisp and rehearsed. "You were notified. You failed to comply. This property is no longer available to you." Trespassing. The word echoed in my head as I stood just behind my wife, listening to someone claim that the place we legally occupied was suddenly not ours to stand in. There had been no eviction hearing, no court order, no notice served by any authority that actually had the power to do so. But none of that seemed to matter in that moment, because the presence of the police gave her words weight they didn't deserve. One of the officers cleared his throat. "Ma'am," he said to my wife, tone formal but firm, "we're here because we received a complaint that you're occupying residence without authorization. We need you to step outside while we sort this out." Outside. That word was worse. Outside meant leaving the threshold. Outside meant conceding something we didn't owe. Outside meant letting someone else rewrite reality just by standing confidently enough to do it. My wife looked past him, directly at the HOA president. "This is our home," she said calmly. "You know that." The HOA president didn't deny it. She didn't argue the facts. She didn't even pretend to be confused. Instead, she smiled a little wider, the kind of smile someone wears when they think they have finally cornered you. "That's not how this works anymore," she replied. "You were given notice. And now, it's being enforced." The officers exchanged another glance. Not hostile, not aggressive, just procedural. The kind of look that says they've been told a story before arriving and they're acting within that frame unless something forces them not to. "Ma'am," the first officer repeated, "we need you to step away from the residence." That was the moment the air changed. Not because of shouting or threats, but because of the sheer wrongness of it. My wife was being told to leave her own home by someone who had no legal authority to make that demand, backed by officers who didn't yet realize they were standing on the wrong side of federal law. She took a slow breath. I could see her steadying herself, not emotionally, but strategically. She wasn't panicking, she wasn't arguing, she was buying time. "I'm not going anywhere," she said evenly. "And you're going to want to slow this down." The HOA president scoffed softly, just loud enough to be heard. "That's not your decision anymore." There it was, the assumption, the belief that confidence equals control, that paperwork waved aggressively enough becomes truth, that if you speak first and loudest, reality bends to you. The second officer stepped forward slightly. "Ma'am, if you refuse to comply, we may have to escalate this." Escalate. Another word that didn't belong. Escalate from what? From standing in your own doorway, from existing in a space you lawfully occupied? My wife didn't move. Instead, she reached into her bag, slowly and deliberately, making sure her hands were visible the entire time. The HOA president's eyes flicked down, alert now, no longer smug. "What are you doing?" she snapped. "Getting documentation," my wife replied. The officer raised a hand slightly, cautious but controlled. "That's fine, ma'am. Just let us know what you're reaching for." She pulled out a small card first, then a folded document. She didn't hand them over immediately. She looked at the officers, not confrontational, just direct. "Before you ask me to leave my home," she said, "you should read this." The HOA president laughed under her breath. "This isn't a debate, this is enforcement." But the officers took the card anyway. As one of them began to read, the confidence in the doorway started to fracture, though no one said anything yet. The HOA president shifted her stance, arms unfolding, then crossing again. She leaned forward slightly, trying to reclaim the moment. "That document doesn't change anything," she said quickly. "We've already cleared this. Military or not, they don't have special treatment here." That sentence hung in the air longer than she intended it to. The officer reading the card stopped. He looked up, not at my wife, but at her. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "who told you that?" The smile vanished. Just for a second, long enough to notice. "It's common knowledge," she replied. "HOA rules supersede." "No," the officer interrupted, quieter now, more serious. "They don't." The second officer stepped closer, now reading over his partner's shoulder. The energy shifted again, subtle but unmistakable. This wasn't a domestic dispute anymore. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was something else. My wife spoke, not to gloat, not to lecture, but to clarify. "I'm protected under federal law. Any attempt to remove me without a court order isn't just invalid. It's illegal." The HOA president's voice sharpened. "That's not true." The officer finally looked directly at her. "It is." Silence. No shouting, no dramatic gestures, just the quiet collapse of assumed authority. The officer handed the card back to my wife. "Ma'am," he said, tone completely changed now, "you're not being asked to leave." Then he turned to the HOA president. "We need to talk." She didn't look like someone about to be evicted. That was the strange part. If you didn't know what was happening, if you walked past our doorway at that exact moment, you would have thought it was just another ordinary interruption in the middle of an ordinary day. She was standing there barefoot, one hand resting against the doorframe, the other holding a thin stack of papers she'd been sorting through minutes earlier. Her hair was pulled back loosely, the way it always was when she was focused on chores or work. No shaking hands, no raised voice, just confusion, quiet and controlled. The house behind her still smelled faintly like the groceries we'd brought in earlier that morning. A paper bag sat open on the kitchen counter, apples spilling slightly over the edge because neither of us had bothered to put them away yet. A box of cereal leaned against it, unopened. There was laundry half folded on the couch, a sock draped over the armrest like it had been forgotten mid-motion. This wasn't a scene of chaos. It was the middle of a normal day that had been interrupted by something that didn't belong. Our child was nearby, not right at the door, but close enough to hear voices, close enough to sense tension without understanding it. She was sitting on the floor with a coloring book, humming softly to herself, occasionally glancing up when the tone of the conversation shifted. My wife had angled her body slightly, instinctively positioning herself between the doorway and the living room, not defensively, just protectively, the way parents do without thinking about it. The paperwork in her hand wasn't dramatic. It wasn't some bold declaration or legal threat. It was work-related. Notes, documents she'd been reviewing earlier. Tucked between them was her work badge, the edge of it visible, the seal catching the light when she moved. She hadn't planned to show it to anyone, it was just there, because that's where she'd set it down when she came home. She listened more than she spoke. When the HOA president talked over her, she didn't interrupt. When the officers repeated themselves, she didn't argue. She asked questions, calm ones, clarifying ones. The kind of questions people ask when they genuinely believe there's been a mistake, not when they're trying to stall. "This must be some kind of mix-up," she said at one point, not defensively, just plainly. "We haven't received anything that would justify this." The HOA president dismissed that immediately, waving a hand as if the explanation wasn't worth entertaining. But my wife didn't react to the dismissal. She didn't bristle. She didn't get indignant. She simply waited, eyes moving from one officer to the other, gauging whether anyone else in the conversation was actually interested in facts. From the outside, she looked composed, but I knew her well enough to recognize what was really happening. She wasn't frozen. She was calculating, running through timelines, ying past interactions, checking details against memory, not because she was afraid, but because she was trying to understand how something so wrong was being presented with such confidence. This was supposed to be a quiet day. That was the part no one on the doorstep seemed to understand. There'd been no warning signs that morning, no raised voices, no heated exchanges, just errands, emails, and plans for dinner. She'd been deciding what to cook later, mentally noting what we already had and what could wait until another shopping trip. Life had been moving forward in the most unremarkable way possible, and now someone was standing in our doorway, acting as if all of that could be erased with a sentence. What made it worse wasn't the accusation itself. It was the tone, the assumption that she would panic, that she would argue emotionally or comply immediately just because uniforms were involved. The HOA president spoke to her as if she were already guilty of something, as if the outcome had been decided, and this was just the formal part where resistance was pointless. But my wife didn't respond the way the HOA president expected. She didn't plead. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't look to me for backup. She stood there, steady, eyes clear, holding onto her paperwork like an anchor, and asked for clarity. "Can you show me the order?" she asked. The question was simple, reasonable, the kind of question that should have ended the entire encounter right there. Instead, the HOA president scoffed. "You don't need to see it. The officers are here to enforce it." That was when something subtle but important happened. One of the officers shifted again, just slightly, the way people do when something doesn't sit right with them. He didn't say anything yet, but his posture changed. His certainty softened. He looked at my wife again, not as a problem to be removed, but as a person trying to understand why she was being treated like one. She noticed it too. She met his eyes briefly, then looked back at the HOA president. "I'm not refusing to cooperate," she said. "I'm asking you to explain why this is happening." The HOA president's patience thinned visibly. Her voice sharpened. "Because you were notified, and because you don't get special treatment." That phrase again. Special treatment. It was delivered with bitterness, not legality, with resentment, not authority. And my wife heard it for what it was. She didn't respond immediately. She glanced back into the house, checking on our child without making it obvious. Our daughter looked up, sensing the pause, eyes wide but calm. My wife gave her a small nod, the kind that says everything is okay even when it isn't. Then she turned back to the officers. "This isn't a criminal eviction," she said quietly. "It's a test." The HOA president snapped her head toward her. "Excuse me." My wife didn't raise her voice. She didn't elaborate. She just said it again, slower this time. "It's a test, to see if we know our rights." That sentence didn't sound rehearsed. It sounded observed, like a conclusion drawn in real time. For the first time since arriving, the HOA president looked uncertain, not scared, not apologetic, just thrown off. The script she'd brought with her hadn't accounted for this response. It assumed panic, or anger, or confusion strong enough to override judgment. Instead, she was facing someone who understood that power doesn't always announce itself loudly, and that real authority doesn't need to rush. The officers listened now, really listened. Not because my wife had threatened them, but because she hadn't. Because she wasn't acting like someone with something to hide. Because nothing about her behavior matched the picture they'd been given before arriving. She stood there, barefoot in her own doorway, paperwork in hand, groceries still waiting to be put away, a child quietly coloring on the floor behind her, and refused to be treated like a trespasser in her own life. And in that moment, before any law was explained, before any statute was cited, before anyone said the word federal, the story had already shifted. Because viewers don't need legal jargon to recognize injustice. They just need to see who's calm, who's normal, and who's trying very hard to turn an ordinary family into a problem that never existed. She didn't raise her voice. That was the thing people usually expect from a villain in a story like this. shouting, threats, obvious hostility. But that's not how she operated. She stood there perfectly composed, posture straight, shoulders relaxed, clipboard tucked neatly against her arm like it was an extension of her body. Her tone never climbed, it never wavered. It stayed even, practiced, almost polite. And that calm confidence made her far more unsettling than anger ever could. You could tell immediately that this wasn't new for her. This wasn't a spontaneous dispute or a misunderstanding that spiraled. She moved like someone following a routine she'd memorized, the way she positioned herself just slightly ahead of the officers, the way she answered questions before they were even fully asked, the way she spoke as if outcomes were already decided somewhere else, and everyone else was just catching up. She didn't ask the police to do anything. She told them what was happening. These residents were notified, she said, flipping a page on her clipboard without looking down. They failed to comply. At this point, removal is standard. Standard. That word carried weight because she delivered it like policy, not opinion, as if there were binders somewhere filled with precedents backing her up. As if resistance was irrational, not because it was wrong, but because it was pointless. One of the officers began to ask a question. Something about documentation, about the nature of the notice, and she cut in smoothly, not rudely, just efficiently. "It's all there," she said, tapping the clipboard lightly with her pen. "HOA enforcement action, civil matter. We've had issues with this address before." Issues, another carefully chosen word, vague enough to sound serious, empty enough to mean nothing unless challenged. She spoke for the cops, not to them. That was the dynamic. She framed the situation before they could, gave them the narrative, the context, the justification. By the time they looked at my wife, they weren't seeing a homeowner. They were seeing a problem, already labeled and filed. And the scariest part was how comfortable she seemed doing it. My wife noticed it too. The way the HOA president never once looked uncertain, never hesitated, never checked with the officers for confirmation. She didn't need to. She assumed compliance because, up until now, she'd always gotten a tea. She wasn't loud, I remember thinking as I watched her. She was sure. And that's what made it dangerous. Dangerous because certainty like that spreads. It fills silence. It pressures people into assuming someone else has already done the legal work, that the details have been handled, that questioning it would be unnecessary, or worse, disruptive. She flipped another page on her clipboard, sighing softly, as if the entire situation were an inconvenience to her schedule. "We've gone back and forth with this family," she said casually, addressing the officers but glancing at my wife. They liked to argue technicalities. That wasn't true, but it didn't need to be. It just needed to sound plausible. My wife didn't react. She didn't correct her. She didn't defend herself. She just listened, eyes steady, letting the HOA president talk herself into a corner without realizing it. "Ma'am," one of the officers said, hesitating now, "can you clarify what specific violation?" The HOA president smiled faintly. "Residency compliance," she said immediately. "They no longer meet the requirements." Requirements. Another vague anchor. Another word designed to discourage follow-up. "And what requirements are those?" my wife asked calmly. The HOA president turned to her for the first time fully, expression tightening just a bit. Not anger. Annoyance. "You were informed," she replied, multiple times. That was her pattern, deflection wrapped in confidence. Every question answered with an implication that the question itself was unreasonable. She shifted her weight, heels clicking softly against the concrete, and glanced at the officers again. "We've had to escalate with other households too," she added, almost as an aside. "This isn't personal." That line landed harder than she intended. Other households. It was said quickly, casually, like an afterthought, but it lingered. My wife caught it immediately. So did I. It was the first hint that this wasn't an isolated incident, that our family wasn't some unique problem she'd stumbled into. We were part of a pattern, whether she meant to reveal it or not. The officers didn't react outwardly, but their attention sharpened. The narrative she was building was starting to show seams. Still, she pressed on, clearly sensing that she needed to maintain control of the moment. "The HOA has the authority to enforce community standards," she said firmly. "And when residents refuse to comply, law enforcement assists with removal. That's how it works." She said it like a rule of nature, like gravity, like something beyond debate. But authority isn't declared, it's proven. And the more she spoke, the more it became clear that her power came from paper and posture, not law. She gestured to the clipboard again, tapping it once more for emphasis. "Everything is documented." My wife glanced at it briefly, then back at her. "Then it shouldn't be a problem to show us the order," she said. For the first time, the HOA president hesitated, just a fraction of a second. But it was there. "I don't need to," she replied quickly. "The officers are already here." That answer didn't satisfy anyone. The first officer frowned slightly. "Ma'am, if there's an eviction order, we'll need to verify." "It's an HOA enforcement action," she interrupted. "We handle it internally." The officer's brow furrowed deeper. "Now, we can't remove someone from their residence without—" She cut him off again, this time with a sharper edge beneath the calm. "You were called here for a reason," she said. "This family has been non-compliant. We're done discussing it." That was the moment her confidence tipped from composed to overplayed, from assured to controlling, and it changed how the officers looked at her. Up until then, she'd been guiding the situation. Now she was trying to force it. My wife remained still, holding her paperwork, watching carefully. She didn't need to argue. The HOA president was doing the work for her. She's done this before, I realized. The certainty, the shortcuts, the way she expected the system to bend around her authority instead of the other way around. And then she said something else, quietly, almost offhand, as if it were common sense. "These situations tend to resolve once people understand they don't have leverage." Leverage, that was the tell. That this was never about rules, or compliance, or community standards. It was about pressure, about seeing how far she could push before someone folded. She looked at my wife like she was waiting for the moment of surrender, waiting for fear, waiting for confusion to crack into compliance. Instead, my wife met her gaze evenly. "You're assuming a lot," she said. The HOA president smiled again, thin and confident. "I usually don't have to assume." And in that moment, even before the law was fully brought into the conversation, it was clear that she wasn't just targeting us. We were just the ones standing in front of her today. My wife didn't move right away. That pause mattered. In a moment like that, movement can be mistaken for submission or defiance, and she chose neither. She stood still, shoulders relaxed, eyes steady, letting the silence stretch just long enough to feel intentional. The HOA president was still talking, still layering confidence over uncertainty, still assuming momentum was on her side. The officers waited, caught between a situation that no longer felt as clear as it had when they arrived, and a woman who clearly expected obedience. Then, slowly, my wife reached into her bag. Not abruptly, not nervously. The motion was deliberate, almost careful, as if she were reminding everyone present that nothing about what she was doing required urgency. One of the officers raised a hand slightly, reflex more than suspicion. "That's fine, ma'am," he said. "Just tell me what you're reaching for." "Documentation," she replied. The HOA president exhaled sharply, the sound halfway between annoyance and impatience. "We've already covered this," she said. "There's nothing you can show that changes the situation." My wife didn't respond to that. She drew out a small card first, then a folded sheet of paper behind it. She held them together in one hand, not offering them yet, just holding them like something she'd carried many times before, something familiar. The card didn't look impressive. That was part of the point. It wasn't large. It wasn't flashy. It didn't announce itself as a turning point. It looked like something that belonged in a wallet, not a courtroom. The kind of thing most people would underestimate if they didn't know what it meant. She extended it toward the officer who had spoken most calmly throughout the exchange. "Before this goes any further," she said evenly, "you should read this." The officer took it, glancing at it briefly before lowering his gaze to actually read. His expression didn't change at first. No visible reaction, no immediate realization, just focus, He read the card once, then flipped it over, scanning the back. Then he read it again, more slowly this time. The second officer leaned in slightly, curiosity pulling him closer. He didn't speak. He just waited. No one said anything. The quiet stretched, thick and uncomfortable, the kind of silence that feels heavier because moments ago the space had been filled with certainty and authority and confident declarations. Now there was nothing but the sound of distant traffic and the faint hum of the refrigerator behind us. The HOA president shifted her weight. "What is that?" she asked, trying to sound dismissive, but the edge was there now. "That's not relevant here." The officer didn't look up. He kept reading. She stepped closer, peering at the card as if proximity alone could diminish its impact. "I've already explained the situation," she said. "This is a civil matter." Still, the officer said nothing. My wife remained still, hands folded loosely in front of her now, watching not the HOA president, but the officers. She knew where the real decision-making power had shifted. It wasn't in the clipboard anymore. The second officer cleared his throat. "Can I see that?" he asked quietly. The first officer handed it over without comment. He read it once, then again. That was when the silence changed. It wasn't just a pause anymore. It was a break, the kind where everyone present senses that the direction of the conversation has altered. "Ed, even if they don't yet understand how." The HOA president laughed, short and sharp. "This is ridiculous," she said. "You're letting her derail enforcement with a card?" The first officer finally looked up. Not at my wife, at her. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "where did you get the information that led you to call us here today?" She blinked, clearly not expecting the question. "From our records," she replied. "From HOA counsel, from—" "Because this," he interrupted, tapping the card lightly with his finger, "suggests something very different." Her expression tightened. "That doesn't apply here." He didn't argue with her. He didn't raise his voice. He simply said, "It might." She scoffed. "No, it doesn't. HOA authority supersedes." "It doesn't," the second officer said quietly. That was the first time anyone had directly contradicted her. She turned toward him sharply. "Excuse me?" He held her gaze. "We need to slow this down." Her calm cracked just enough to show irritation. "There's nothing to slow down. She's refusing to comply." My wife spoke then, not loudly, not dramatically, just enough to recenter the conversation. "I'm not refusing," she said. "I'm asking you to be careful." The HOA president let out a frustrated breath. "You're not in a position to." That's when federal law entered a conversation it was never invited to. The words weren't spoken aloud. They settled over the moment like a realization, like something everyone felt before anyone named it. The officer handed the card back to my wife. His demeanor had changed completely now. Gone was the procedural neutrality. In its place was caution. "Ma'am," he said to her, "do you have additional documentation?" She nodded once and unfolded the paper she'd been holding, though she didn't offer it yet. "I do." The HOA president stepped forward again, urgency creeping into her voice. "You can't seriously be considering this," she said. "We have procedures." The officer raised a hand, stopping her mid-sentence. "We're not removing anyone from their residence right now." Her eyes widened, just slightly. "That's not your decision." "It is," he replied. The second officer nodded in agreement. "We're going to need to verify some things." The HOA president's confidence faltered, not completely, but enough to notice. She opened her mouth to speak, then closed it again, recalibrating. "This is unnecessary," she said finally. "You're complicating a simple enforcement action." The first officer shook his head. "This isn't simple anymore." She tried a different angle, turning toward my wife with forced patience. "You should have disclosed this earlier." My wife met her gaze evenly. "You didn't ask." That landed harder than any accusation. The HOA president's voice sharpened. "You don't get to dictate how this works." "No," my wife replied. "The law does." The officers exchanged a look, brief but decisive. "We're going to step back," one of them said. "No one is leaving this home today." The HOA president's composure slipped. "This is outrageous," she said. "You're letting her manipulate the situation." The officer turned to her fully now. "Ma'am, I need you to stop." Silence again. But this time it wasn't confusion. It was consequence. She stood there, clipboard still in hand, suddenly unsure of how much weight it carried. The script she'd arrived, "Ith," no longer applied. The authority she'd assumed was no longer unquestioned. My wife didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She simply stood in her doorway, exactly where she'd been all along. And just before anyone explained why that small card mattered, just before the words "federal law" were spoken out loud, the truth was already clear. This wasn't an eviction anymore. It was a mistake. The explanation didn't come as a lecture. No one pulled out a statute book or started reciting numbers. That's not how the moment unfolded. It came through consequence, through what suddenly stopped happening, through what the officers refused to do next. 1 minute earlier, my wife had been told to step outside. Removal had been spoken about like it was inevitable. Authority had been assumed. And then, without any dramatic announcement, the momentum died. The officers no longer moved forward. They didn't repeat the order. They didn't ask her to comply again. They stood where they were, shoulders squared, eyes alert, as if an invisible line had been drawn on the ground that no one was willing to cross. The HOA president sensed it immediately. "Why are we stopping?" she demanded, her calm finally thinning into irritation. "You were called here to enforce this." One of the officers took a breath before answering. "Because there are protections involved here." That was all he said. Protections. No explanation yet, just enough to signal that the situation had crossed out of her control. She shook her head sharply. "That's irrelevant. HOA enforcement doesn't—" "It does," he interrupted. Not harshly, not angrily, just firmly. "It does when it intersects with federal law." The word "fade." Rao landed like a weight, not dramatic, heavy, final. The second officer stepped slightly to the side, creating physical space between my wife and the HOA president. It was subtle but deliberate, a quiet repositioning that said more than any explanation could. Whatever authority the HOA president thought she had no longer extended past that point. My wife spoke then, but only to clarify, not to dominate the conversation. "There are laws that limit when and how someone can be removed from their home," she said, "especially under certain conditions." The HOA president scoffed. "You can't just hide behind that." "I'm not hiding," my wife replied. "I'm standing exactly where I'm allowed to be." The officers nodded slightly, confirming without elaboration. They explained just enough for the situation to make sense, not to educate the HOA president, but to justify their own decision to stop. They explained that an HOA does not have the authority to evict someone on its own, that removal from a residence requires a valid court order, that even with a court order there are circumstances where enforcement must be delayed or handled differently, that certain residents are protected from sudden removal, harassment, or coercive tactics meant to force compliance. They didn't say all of this at once. It came out piece by piece, each clarification quietly dismantling the story the HOA president had built. She tried to interrupt. "We sent notices." "That doesn't authorize removal," the officer replied. She tried again. "They're in violation." "That doesn't override protections." Again. "This is a civil matter, and that's exactly why we can't do what you're asking," he said. The pattern was clear now. Every path she tried to take ended at the same wall. What the HOA could not do became painfully obvious. They could not order police to remove a resident without a court order. They could not bypass federal protections by labeling an eviction as enforcement. They could not intimidate someone into leaving by using officers as leverage. They could not manufacture urgency where the law demanded caution. And most importantly, they could not pretend ignorance after being informed. That last part mattered. The officers made it clear that once they became aware of the protections involved, they were obligated to stop. Not slow down, stop. Continuing would expose them, and anyone pushing the action forward, to serious consequences. The HOA president bristled. "So what now?" she asked. "You just walk away?" "No," one officer replied. "Now we document." That word should have worried her more than it did. Document meant records, reports, timelines, statements. It meant this wasn't disappearing quietly. It meant the encounter itself was now evidence. The officer turned to my wife. "Have there been prior attempts like this?" My wife didn't hesitate. Yes, the HOA president snapped. That's not. The officer raised his hand again. Ma'am, please. My wife explained briefly, calmly. Notices, threats, pressure, attempts to force compliance through fear rather than process. She didn't embellish. She didn't dramatize. She simply stated what had happened. The officers listened closely, the kind of listening that comes from recognizing a pattern rather than a one-time mistake. Have you been asked to leave before without an order? One asked. Ed. Yes. Have police been contacted before? No, she said. This was the first time. The HOA president shifted again, discomfort now obvious. This is being blown out of proportion, she said. We're just trying to maintain standards. The officer looked at her steadily. Harassment isn't a standard. That was the first word that carried real weight. Harassment, not dispute, not misunderstanding. Harassment, they explained, still without lecturing, that repeated attempts to force someone out of their home without legal authority can cross from civil enforcement into unlawful conduct. That knowingly ignoring protections doesn't excuse violations. That continuing after being informed escalates the severity. What kind of violations? The HOA president asked, her voice tight now. The officer didn't answer immediately. He chose his words carefully. Serious ones. That was enough. The realization settled slowly. This wasn't just a failed eviction attempt. This was a record of behavior. A pattern. One that had now been observed, interrupted, and documented by people outside the HOA's influence. The officers made it clear they would not take any enforcement action. They advised my wife not to leave the home. They advised her to keep documentation. They advised her that if further attempts were made, she should contact legal counsel immediately. Then one of them said something that changed everything. Ma'am, he said to the HOA president, you should not contact them again without proper legal guidance. Her eyes widened. Are you threatening me? No, he replied. I'm warning you. The distinction mattered. She tried to recover, straightening her clip. Bored, reclaiming her posture. This is ridiculous, she said. You're overreacting. The officer shook his head. No, you underestimated the law. That was when the truth became impossible to ignore. She didn't just misunderstand the law, she violated it. Repeatedly. Not once, not accidentally, repeatedly, through notices, through pressure, through escalating tactics that finally involved police. The officers didn't spell out every penalty. They didn't need to. They hinted at them just enough. Civil liability, criminal exposure if harassment continued, consequences for false statements made to law enforcement, consequences for attempting removal without authority. Enough to shift fear from the doorway to the clipboard. The HOA president fell quiet. My wife stood exactly where she had been standing the entire time, calm, grounded, unmoved. The house behind her was still the same, groceries still on the counter, laundry still unfinished. Our child still coloring on the floor, oblivious to the legal earthquake that had just happened in the doorway. The officers concluded the interaction professionally. They told the HOA president they would be filing a report. They told her no further action would be taken today. They told my wife she was free to close the door. And as they turned to leave, one of them said something quietly, almost as an aside. If this continues, it won't stay an HOA issue. That was the gut punch, because now the story wasn't about what the law said. It was about what would happen next. The change didn't happen all at once. It never does. False authority doesn't explode. It deflates, quietly, awkwardly, in stages. And once it starts, there's no stopping it. At first, the HOA president tried to recover her footing with posture. She straightened her shoulders, lifted her chin, adjusted the clipboard in her hands like it still carried weight. She spoke again, but the cadence was off now. The certainty that had anchored her earlier statements was gone, replaced by something thinner, defensive. So what you're saying, she began, carefully choosing her words, is that this is just a delay. No one answered her immediately. One of the officers looked down at his notepad and began writing. The sound of the pen moving across paper was soft, almost polite, but it landed harder than anything else that had been said. Documentation had started. That meant the moment wasn't theoretical anymore. It had entered a system she didn't control. "This isn't a delay," the officer said without looking up. "This is a stop." She frowned. "Temporary." He finally looked at her then. "Indefinite." The word hung there, heavy and unmistakable. She opened her mouth as if to argue, then seemed to realize she didn't know what argument would even work anymore. The rules she'd been relying on had dissolved. The shortcuts she'd taken were suddenly visible. The clipboard in her hands, once the symbol of her authority, now looked like what it was: paper. Just paper. "Well," she said finally, forcing a small laugh that didn't land, "this can all be sorted out later." The officers didn't agree. They didn't disagree either. They simply didn't respond. Their attention had shifted away from her. They were no longer engaging with her explanations or reassurances. They were wrapping up, closing out, disengaging. That shift was unmistakable. They stepped back slightly, creating physical distance not just from my wife, but from the entire confrontation. The posture of enforcement was gone. In its place was the posture of conclusion. When law enforcement disengages like that, it's not ambiguous, it's final. One of the officers turned to my wife. "You're free to go about your day," he said. Free, as if she'd ever been anything else. My wife nodded politely. "Thank you." The HOA president bristled at that. "So you're just leaving?" she asked the officers, disbelief creeping into her voice now. "After everything?" "Yes," the officer replied simply. She gestured helplessly with the clipboard. "But I've documented violations, notices, non-compliance." The officer glanced at the clipboard briefly, then back at her. "Those are not enforceable the way you think they are." She shook her head. "They've always been." That was the moment. The sentence she didn't realize she'd just confessed with. "Always." The officer paused. "Not legally," he said. "But people don't always know that." Her jaw tightened. "So what now?" she demanded. "They just get away with it?" "No one is getting away with anything," he replied. "But you're done here today. Done. Not delayed, not rescheduled. Done." She stood there, silent now, eyes darting between the officers and my wife, as if trying to find a crack somewhere she could wedge herself back into control. There wasn't one. The officers turned toward their car. One of them paused and added, without looking back, "If there are further attempts to remove them without proper authority, that will be noted." Not threatened, not warned loudly, not dramatized, just noted. They walked away. The sound of their footsteps faded down the driveway, replaced by the quiet hum of the neighborhood. Birds. A lawnmower somewhere in the distance. The world resuming as if nothing had happened. Except everything had. The HOA president was left standing alone at the foot of our walkway. No officers beside her, no audience, no leverage. Just a woman holding paperwork that no longer meant anything. She tried one last time to salvage the moment. "This isn't over," she said, voice tight. My wife looked at her calmly. "That depends on you," the HOA president scoffed weakly. "You think this changes things?" My wife didn't answer. She didn't need to. The officer's absence had already answered for her. The HOA president lingered for a few seconds longer, as if waiting for someone to come back, to reinforce her authority, to restore the balance she'd lost. When that didn't happen, she turned sharply and walked away, heels clicking faster than before, confidence replaced by frustration. When the door finally closed, the house exhaled with us. The quiet inside felt different now, not tense, settled. My wife leaned against the door for a moment, not from fear or relief, but from the sudden clarity of what had just unfolded. Our child looked up from the floor. "Is it okay now?" she asked. "Yes," my wife said gently, "it's okay," and that should have been the end of it, but it wasn't, because once the adrenaline faded, something colder took its place, a realization that crept in slowly, uninvited, and impossible to ignore. Every time she'd done this before, it worked. That sentence didn't come from anger. It came from logic, from replaying the interaction in reverse, from recognizing how easily authority can be manufactured when no one challenges it. She'd relied on confidence, on paperwork, on the assumption that people don't know their rights, especially when uniforms are involved. She'd counted on panic, on hesitation, on the natural instinct to comply first and question later. And most of the time that instinct wins. How many doors had she knocked on before ours? How many families had folded because they didn't want trouble? How many people had stepped outside their own homes because someone with a clipboard and a title told them to? The officers' reactions made it clear this wasn't the first time they'd seen something like this, but it might have been the first time it had stopped so cleanly. The more we thought about it, the clearer it became. This wasn't a one-off abuse of authority, it was a method, a system. Paper power backed by confidence, wielded against people who didn't know where the line was. And until that moment, no one had forced her to confront that line. The collapse of her authority wasn't dramatic. There were no handcuffs, no shouting, no public spectacle, just a quiet withdrawal of support. The system refusing to carry her any further. That was what made it terrifying in hindsight, because if the law hadn't been there to stop her, if my wife hadn't known exactly when to stand still instead of stepping back, the outcome would have been different. Not just for us, for anyone. That realization reframed everything. This wasn't about a single HOA president overstepping. It was about how often false authority goes unchallenged. How easily confidence can impersonate legality. How many people mistake paperwork for power because no one has ever shown them the difference. As the house returned to its normal rhythms, groceries finally put away, laundry folded, dinner plans resumed, the weight of that understanding lingered. The threats on paper were gone now, reduced to nothing more than ink and assumption. But the consequences of exposing them were only just beginning. By the time the house settled back into its normal rhythm, there was no victory lap, no raised voices, no sense of triumph. What lingered instead was something heavier and harder to shake, a quiet awareness that this wasn't rare, and it wasn't dramatic, and it wasn't confined to one neighborhood or one person with a title on a piece of paper. It happened without sirens, without headlines, without anyone calling it abuse. It happened the way these things usually do, calmly, confidently, and just close enough to legality that most people don't stop to question it. That was the part that stayed with us. The HOA president didn't storm off defeated. She didn't apologize. She didn't admit fault. She simply lost the thing she'd been relying on, unquestioned compliance. And when that vanished, there was nothing left to replace it. No backup authority, no hidden permission, no deeper legal foundation. Just habits that had gone unchallenged for too long. In the days that followed, nothing exploded. There were no angry emails, no sudden retaliation, no dramatic follow-up. And in a strange way, that silence said more than any confrontation could have, because silence is what happens when false authority realizes it's been seen. We replayed the moment over and over, not because it was exciting, but because it was unsettling. How easily it could have gone the other way. How one step backward, one moment of hesitation, one assumption that they must be right would have changed everything. There was no physical force used that day, no threats shouted, no locks changed, just pressure, just implication. Just a confident person standing beside uniforms, speaking as if the outcome had already been decided. And for most people that's enough. That's how this works. Quietly, everywhere. It works on elderly homeowners who don't want trouble. It works on families who are tired. It works on immigrants who fear authority. It works on renters who don't know where policy ends and law begins. It works because confidence feels official, because paper feels legitimate, because people are taught to comply first and question later. No one wakes up thinking, today I might be illegally removed from my own home. They wake up thinking about errands, work, dinner, kids. And that's exactly when this kind of power thrives, when no one is prepared to challenge it. What stopped it that day wasn't anger. It wasn't shouting. It wasn't aggression. It was knowledge. A single document, a clear boundary. A moment where law replaced assumption. And even then, it didn't stop because the HOA president suddenly understood she was wrong. It stopped because the officers did, because once federal law entered the room, confidence alone couldn't carry her anymore. That distinction matters, because people often imagine abuse of authority as loud, obvious, unmistakable. They imagine villains who yell, who threaten, who break the ings. But most of the time, it doesn't look like that. Most of the time, it looks polite. It looks organized. It looks like someone telling you calmly that this is how it's done, and waiting to see if you'll object. And when no one objects, it becomes precedent. Habit. Routine. That's why this story isn't about us. It's about how many people never realize they're being tested. How often authority figures push just far enough to see who will resist and who won't. The scariest part wasn't the police presence. It wasn't the clipboard. It wasn't even the threat of removal. It was how normal it all felt. How easily it could have ended differently without anyone raising their voice. How many times it probably already had. We didn't share this to embarrass anyone. We didn't share it to celebrate. We shared it because this kind of thing survives on silence and uncertainty. On the idea that people won't talk about it, won't compare notes, won't realize it's happening elsewhere too. Confidence isn't authority, paper isn't power, law is, and it only works if someone knows it's there. If federal law hadn't been involved that day, she would have gotten away with it. Pause, fade out,